The more time passes, the more people understand that Todd Howard and his shortness is nothing but an unequivocal blunder to progression. And once again, boys, we were right. We called this, we knew this, and we were the ones lighting the way. Pat yourselves on the back because we were right once again.
A number of years ago, Todd Howard sat down during the summertime with Jeff Keighley and talked about his vision for the Elder Scrolls 6. One of the core things that he brought up at the time was the need for the studio to have a technological leap that just wasn't available at the time for the Elder Scrolls 6. We saw some of that technological leap with Starfield, and in all honesty, it just isn't enough with what we're seeing from the industry nowadays. Bethesda, in many regards, has stagnated. The user reception with Starfield is a great indication of the dissatisfaction that many feel with modern day Bethesda game studios, and also the feeling that we just keep on having releases that are a little bit like Skyrim. It's just Skyrim in many ways, the success of it, that's awesome, great success for Bethesda. They keep remaking it and such. That's always the funny story we talk about. But Bethesda keeps trying to duplicate that success, and they haven't really evolved their game formula. Even their engine hasn't really evolved that much, and that has been to the ire of a lot of the gaming community. While we see other developers doing laps around them, there just seems to be a lot of excuses for Bethesda, their style of an RPG, which at this point feels ancient. And the blame is largely on Todd Howard and his design.
Look at how short he is next to Come Dumpster Mommy Eva Pernell. Oh my god, this is insane, okay? This is where all the problems arise. There are some groups of people that should never be given power. And Todd Howard represents an extremely devastating, yet small, get it? Small part of this community. Todd Howard has not been relevant for years now. Bethesda's an absolute joke. Even if Elder Scrolls 6 actually looks like a modern day game, you know what's gonna happen? People are just gonna call it shit anyway because the story's dumb. Because it's gonna be written by Emil, who wrote Starfield and then doubled down and wrote Starfield Shattered Space. And the only difference between Shattered Space and Starfield is that he decided to not go on a Twitter tirade when Shattered Space released, and no one liked it. But nothing's gonna change for Elder Scrolls 6. And while we did see the mixed review for Starfield, if we write in Steam a DB Starfield Shattered Space, you know what we get? You know what we get in Starfield Shattered Space? Well, I'm gonna show you. Let me share my screen here real quick. There we go. This is what we get with Shattered Space. Yeah. Only 28% of users are viewing this absolute atrocity positive. And you know what's the best part? Roughly no one played this game. Roughly only 6% of the player base decided that they're gonna try Shattered Space in the first place. So that is the most dedicated and loyal Bethesda followers that actually did that. And even they could not lie to themselves, and they called Shattered Space rash. And it shows, obviously. And again, I want to die under those ties. Not gonna lie. I know she has tattoos. I know she's British, y'all. But, I mean, and Moses split those eyes so far apart that, I mean, they had no trouble crossing. But I still stand by what I want to do, and I want to do that. It is what it is, boys. I did not choose this life. It just happens.
Design philosophy. He is the main guy at Bethesda, and he is getting the blunt of the blame. But also, I think the big problem with Todd Howard is all the yes men around him, and I think that indication came very clearly the last couple of months, especially after Shattered Space, which was a god-awful DLC expansion, and one of the lead design directors, Emil Pagliarulo, he went on the defensive for Bethesda and was just trying to argue that, this game's not everybody's cup of tea, but
it's a game. It should be the majority of people's cup of tea. Unless you're trying to make something very specific. But considering how bland Starfield was, this should have been everyone's cup of tea. The story should have been the typical hero's journey with a conclusion. And most people would be happy with that. But Starfield was an aberration. of God's creation in this respect, and it completely failed, needless to obviously say. And yeah, there we go. And we watched also a video where ex Bethesda developers in high positions talked about Todd Howard. And all of them are literally ass slickers. Professional at that. That's how you get a good position, boys. Again, remember, you always need to know how to smooch it just enough. Never say no too many times, because people who say no too many times get fired eventually. You need to know when you can say no, and you need to know when you can get your idea in and sell it as someone else's idea, because that's better than you actually taking the credit and making your boss feel stupid, because that's also going to get you fired. Being up the ladder is just essentially managing how good you lie about how valuable you are, and how good you kiss your ass that your boss doesn't kiss your ass. And then skill somewhere exists there in the middle, I guess.
But I just feel like that dismisses a lot of the complaints that people have had about Starfield and Bethesda for the longest time. And I think a lot of what we've seen from Bethesda and some of the top brass the last couple of years is just a lot of those defensive comments and not really taking accountability for how they have stagnated in terms of their quality. So we've seen Todd Howard, he's talked about some of their ambition with the Elder Scrolls 6. This is a great example of it. He talked about this last year, saying that he wants it to be the ultimate fantasy world simulator. And I think people just really want there to be a proper evolution, because if this is just more Skyrim, I think there's going to be a
I don't agree with this. I don't think people want an evolution. I'm completely fine with Skyrim 2. Most people are completely fine with Skyrim 2. Elder Scrolls 6 doesn't need to be anything special. Elder Scrolls 6 just needs to be fun. It needs to have good gameplay. It needs to have good exploration, good quests, a decent story, and it can literally be a carbon copy of Skyrim for all that I care. And it's gonna sell like hotcakes, and the majority of people are gonna be okay. This is not some kind of live or die situation for the players. Unless there's innovation, we're gonna hate it. No, there can be some minor things that they change, and there definitely will be, but innovation is not something that is desperately needed.
immense disappointment. People want to see an evolution of what Bethesda has been, and the Elder Scrolls 6, the gap between Skyrim to
Would
that
be
game is going
nice,
to be
but
about 15 or so years. This needs to be something that is grand. It needs to be monumental. And in this current form, especially with what we've seen Bethesda producing the last couple of years, there's just no indication that they can deliver that anymore. Now, we've also seen Todd Howard again. This is what I mean. We just hear a lot of excuses and a lot of defensive comments. He talked about this earlier this year. It was a couple of months ago, around the time Shattered Space released. He said that their games are irresponsibly large. We cut very little from our games, which in hindsight, that's just not exactly
stupid.
something that is great to hear, especially because it feels like almost quantity over quality. And that really was a core tenet with, Starfield's design. 1,000 planets. You can go everywhere pretty much. Except the problem is that a lot of the quality content is so far apart that it just creates an experience that isn't cohesive enough. Pretty much a lot of the mistakes that they made with Fallout 4 with like Radiant quests, they just brought it into a bigger scale with Starfield. Now, earlier on in the year, when Starfield's reception started to turn a little bit more sour, I do think it has turned a lot more sour because of games like Baldur's Gate 3 and Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, experiences that have released right alongside some of these expansions and Starfield's base game experience, and just put Bethesda in a negative light. It's like I said, the competition, when you have other RPGs, role-playing experiences that, look so much better and they play so much better, people are going to compare. They're going to make notes about Bethesda up against that competition. But Todd Howard in May said this: he reckons he knows why Starfield was so divisive. It was too different than you've seen from us in past. And again, these are the defensive, twisting. We've seen this the last couple of years. It's not even just Starfield. Fallout 76, a lot of the mistakes that they made with that game, Todd Howard and his top brass at Bethesda put a lot of the blame on just the bugs, but it was the design philosophy day one that a lot of people took issue with. Obviously, Fallout 76 has turned it around, but you still can't rewrite how the game began. But Howard said about Starfield, this was in May, on the Kind of Funny podcast, we see a lot of players saying, this is what I want out of a Bethesda game, which is to explore a world in a certain way, and Starfield didn't give me that. I prefer the way it's done in Fallout or Elder Scrolls. And although Howard thinks that's perfectly understandable, he says it's just not the experience Starfield sets out to provide. But the problem is that Starfield in many regards is just grabbing a lot of the gameplay elements from Elder Scrolls and Fallout and bringing it into this new franchise, and it just does not work. And I think that's a big complaint that a lot of people have been bringing up. And Todd Howard just doesn't at all acknowledge any of this. And all of Bethesda has not acknowledged.
If you contextualize what Todd Howard is saying here, it's honestly even more scary if you try to understand his perspective and assume his words are true, which you should honestly never obviously do. But if you do assume that, then one scary thing kind of becomes clear. That Todd Howard has literally no clue what we like. Because Todd Howard, in this case, thinks that we like to go to a place, spend a minute running to a location, and go inside of it, and that's the gameplay loop that everyone is so happy about. Which is not even remotely close to truth, obviously. But Todd Howard, if we assume what he is saying is true, then that's the gameplay loop that Todd Howard thinks is actually important when it comes to games like this, which is, needless to say, insanity.
This. He says, I do think for us, particularly me, going into a science fiction game, I want to be able to land on all the planets. I want the game to say yes to us, knowing that the content is going to be different than you've seen from us in the past.
Oh, if I play such a game, I kind of want to fly my ship. You know what I'm saying? I kind of want to fly my ship, not just be in a shitty shooting gallery.
And then even more recently, after Shattered Space, we got an explanation through Phil Spencer about how Todd Howard felt about the reception towards Shattered Space. Again, a universally hated DLC expansion, probably some of the worst content that Bethesda has.
Classic IGN 7 out of 10, boys. IGN Spain an 8 out of 10 because Spain. Forbes, who gives a shit that Forbes exists? IGN Italy, a 6 out of 10. Someone's getting fired right there.
Ever put out. And Todd Howard pretty much said that it was just the buggy's fault for why it was so negative. Spencer, in an interview with GameFile, brought up a conversation that Phil had with Todd Howard about Shattered Space. Todd and I were talking about Shattered Space. Starfield is a game I put a ton of hours into, blah, 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 blah. And he goes on a mention about Howard. I think some of the feedback on the expansion is, we wanted more features. And Todd's like, well, should we have waited to put buggies out? The Bethesda had figured keeping the vehicle for the DLC could have helped fleshed it out more and I guess garnered a better reception. But again, the core complaints with...
You know what's the funny part about that? That people who are playing Shattered Space call the buggy the worst part of it, because you can't really use it on the planet, because the planet's still just a bunch of RNG rocks with a red fog tint all over it. And it's not designed to be traversed with a buggy. You literally can't traverse it properly with this garbage dumpster fire. If they released the buggy on Shattered Space, even more people would be upset, because you release a vehicle with an expansion, you can't even use it properly in the expansion because it's not built around it, which is hilarious.
Shattered Space had nothing really to do with the vehicle, the land buggy. It was more so with the quality of the content, which was terrible. It was lackluster. Spencer continued, and so I think you're trying to tune both development effort and the impact of the expansion. I think there will always be a balance to managing the game month to month, but not every game will do expansions. And the big thing about the buggy is it was introduced, but the game's, these planets and everything...
Do you want to hear a secret? This is just gonna encapsulate how bad Bethesda is at currently doing Bethesda things. You see these strange pole things? Yeah, they're supposed to be landmarks so you know where the road is. The one that you're supposed to run with your feet, by the way, on, not the buggy. But still, these things are supposed to tell you where the road is. No one who plays this game uses the fucking road. Most people probably don't even know that this is supposed to be a road. I guess that's the reason why Blizzard put fences on all their roads, so people don't mistake it for just some kind of minor crevice.
thing weren't designed around it. So it at times just feels extremely awkward to use. And it was also, the buggy was buggy in of itself on, Dazra, the new expansion map that was introduced in Shattered Space. So in many ways, it just does not work that well. There's just so many issues with the things that Todd Howard has brought up and the excuses that they've had for, why the reception with Starfield and its expansion has been negative. And he is not alone with this. We've seen Emil Pagliarulo, the design director at Bethesda, pretty much saying the same thing. That's why I'm saying there's a lot of yes men around Todd. It might not be every.
I was gonna say this. Listen, if your boss tells you this is why we failed, my God, yes, boss man, this is why we failed. I completely agree with you. This is like we should have seen this. You're right. Oh my God, I'm so with you on this. Admittedly, that's a bad way. Again, I told you about the greatest ass-licking maneuver in existence on the Magic Channel. I'm not sure if I should share this it's not real esoteric knowledge, but I'm not sure I should share to you the ultimate ass-licking maneuver that has ever existed here. Because psychologically, this move is pure perfection. It has power that the normal man should honestly not wield. Okay, boys, do you want to know it? I could tell you, but I'm kind of reluctant to a degree, Okay. I'm gonna tell you. No need to cock block you that much. Okay? Listen. This is how you do it. Let's imagine your boss says some stupid, crazy, dumbass bullshit. And this is gonna be your response. You can't use it too often, but this is the ultimate. Spread them cheeks apart and let God take the wheel things, okay? This is what you say. Almost pretty much word for word. You can interpretate a little bit on your own if you want, but this is the gist of it, alright? Are you ready? Are you sitting down? Oh, wow! I really like that idea. I like that. That's what you emphasize this, that you like it, which emphasizes your importance because you're an important person, obviously, and that emphasizes to them that you are thinking of from this perspective, that you like this, which means that you saying yes to that is important because you like it and other people like to be liked. And considering you're saying it from the perspective that you yourself liked it, you must not be just randomly saying that because you're thinking alike. You're brethren. Such a simple sentence has so much psychological manipulation in it. It is just, okay, listen, you can't spread this knowledge too far. If we spread this knowledge too far, India's cooked, okay? Because everyone is going to say this constantly because it is one of the most genius sentences ever designed in a corporate setting. Oh wow, I really like that. Yeah, this seems good. I like it. The second I like it is a little bit too much in most situations, admittedly. But yes, it is genius, it is perfect, and don't use it too much, but this will get you results.
Everyone's cup of tea, but what is? Emil said in this interview that was done around the time Shattered Space released that Bethesda was proud of Starfield. They also said Shattered Space, again, was something that they're extremely proud of, and they considered themselves as one of the best DLC makers in this industry, and maybe that was true 10 or so years ago, but again, other developers have done laps around them, especially CD Projekt Red. But I guess one big thing that irks me about modern day Bethesda is how reliant they just are on Todd Howard. He is viewed as the god, the guy that calls all of the shots. And I think it does raise the question, can Bethesda exist without Todd Howard? And I think the answer is a resounding yes. And maybe
yeah. Todd Howard is a figurehead, but everyone can always be replaced.
They need to actually,
except you watching my videos, that cannot be replaced. I love you and you love me, okay?
Move past the hurdles that they currently face. We've seen interviews, some life pieces about Todd in which they call him the Christopher Nolan of,
he looks so small. I can't. This couch looks ginormous against him.
Gaming. He is a larger than life figure. He is the face of Bethesda Game Studio, something that has been the case for the last decade or so. But again, all the issues, everything, he is the one who's going to face that blame. And that's why I bring him up, and that's why I do say Todd
Howard is blind to what makes the world. And he will never see it, and he will always make the same mistakes. He looks at the full picture, but has been blinded to the small details that make it up. And those small details are always the ugliness.
Howard he's a Bethesda problem. He is the problem that we currently face, and I do think that you can look to a lot of the interviews and a lot of the things we're about to go over as evidence of that. We had this piece that came a couple of years ago. This was around the time Fallout 76 was an absolute disaster. The human toll of Fallout 76's disastrous launch. Kotaku talked to a number of developers that worked on Fallout 76, in which they raised a lot of the red flags about how Todd Howard's management style with that game was a disaster. They mention a lot here, but a couple of the excerpts from this piece that I really wanted to point out was this one. According to one source, Todd Howard was supposed to be in charge of the game, but he spent most of his time working on Starfield, which reportedly started development after Fallout 4 shipped in 2015. Starfield was Todd Howard's baby. He's made that quite clear.
That's insane.
One source told Kotaku that his subordinates would call it seagulling when he would fly by later and shit all over an idea that had popular traction within the design team. Another source felt that Howard was...
To be fair, blaming Todd Howard for shitting all over an idea is not really fair, because I mean, we're talking about the Bethesda development team. That idea was probably shit, and the fact that the development team liked it doesn't mean it was good.
Was a decent executive producer, albeit one with a bigger is better design philosophy, and we've seen how that, has hurt Bethesda in recent years. Another excerpt talking about his management style. The more single-player focused main studio at Rockville, which Todd oversees, was the most favored, most profitable studio within the ZeniMax portfolio, and developers from Austin felt resentful that the main studio seemed to undervalue the multiplayer expertise that they'd built on projects like Battlecry, canceled online action game. The friction between Maryland and the other studios is very real. This is what this report brought up at the time. One of the major criticisms of 76 was that it launched with no NPCs to interact with. Though there were some senior level concerns about technical challenges, almost none of the Bethesda designers wanted the game to launch without NPCs. Executive producer Todd Howard was not willing to budge all the way up to launch, and obviously the feedback that he got from players, which was just obvious, but people wanted a Fallout experience in their Fallout game. And yes, that involves human NPCs. But again, it is Todd's way or the highway, it seems. And just to understand how involved Todd Howard is in everything that Bethesda does, former Elder Scrolls dev, this was one of the lead developers on Skyrim, said Todd Howard would sometimes work on 24 projects at once and is the face of Bethesda partly because he's incredibly photogenic, which I truly do believe.
Believe that? Dude, again, I'm making a fun of... I'm sorry, but I think honestly a shit on the street is more photogenic than Todd Howard. Especially when you actually contextualize that this is a pebble, this is Todd Howard. Yeah, it's just hilarious. I mean, and he's already wearing boots that make him like 3 inches taller.
He's been that way for the last 15 or so years. And Bruce Nesmith said that Bethesda's head of publishing, Pete Hines, who retired recently, has made no bones about the fact that when he took over the marketing, Bethesda needed a face. They needed a person for the audience, for the customers, the fans to identify. Having an entire crew doesn't work well. You needed someone who is that guy, and Todd made a very natural choice for that. He's incredibly photogenic. He's amazing in person and in interviews and on stage.
Photogenic, okay. Maybe if we're talking about actual pictures, but in real life, well, not real life, but in even videos where he like fucking moves, and I don't know about that one, Chief.
And he was the boss of the dev team at the time, so he becomes that role. Nesmith also mentioned that near the end of his tenure, Howard would have somewhere around 24 projects on his plate at once, some small, some large. There's mobile games, there's remote things that he's just has to look at, in addition to a variety of larger projects, so that's a lot, which it almost seems like, Todd's being spread too thin. Howard isn't leaving Bethesda anytime soon. He's still fairly young and quite vital, and I think we have many more years before we have to worry ourselves with Todd Howard not making games, Nesmith said. Bruce Nesmith told Minimax he initially proposed that the space role-playing game only have around 24 systems instead of the 120 it ended up with, which is something a lot of people have brought up, since Starfield's release, saying that it would have been a lot smarter. The point was made quite legitimately that once you've done one solar system, doing 100 is really not adding to your work all that much, he said. And then he continued saying that Todd pretty much pulled the number.
This is, by the way, something I agree with. I don't understand the people who are saying, oh, they should have just concentrated on one solar system. Well, they already did concentrate on one solar system, and everything else is just an RNG iteration of that. And it's not good, because the thing that they made with hand was shit. And by the way, Shattered Space and that place not being RNG, kind of vindicates me on this point fully, because it's bad and it's shit and no one likes it.
100 for the number of star systems out of thin air, but the more we went on, the more it was like, okay, core activity takes place in these 2 dozen in the settle system region, and the rest of it is open space. But people love our big games. They love that open area to explore, so let's go ahead and let them have it, although that's a misconception of what people actually love about a Bethesda experience, in my opinion. And then it went down to, okay, how do we make exploration meaningful? And once again, you have to succeed on one planet. Once you've got that formula, you have the formula for all the planets. And I do think that this is clear indication that there was obviously some conversation about how to handle planets, the 1,000.
See what I mean, by the way? Completely right. Again, it doesn't matter if it's a 1 planet or a million planets in this case. They failed making them in general.
Planets, early development with this game, but obviously it's Todd's way or the highway. And then we even heard this opinion pretty much said by another developer, a former Bethesda lead artist talked about this. And this is Nate Perkipile. He worked at Bethesda for 14 years. He was a lead artist on 76 and a number of other Bethesda experiences over the years. He said, I know a lot of people have thoughts on Starfield and how it is probably too big, should have been smaller, etc. I agree with a lot of that. And while I enjoyed working at Bethesda a lot when we were about 65 to 110 people on Fallout 3 and Skyrim, I enjoyed it a lot less when we kept growing and growing. But getting back to Bruce Nesmith's remarks, because he's said a lot the last year or two, which I think is really eye-opening about the behind the scenes that has been happening at Bethesda for the last so many years. Nesmith talked about some of the role-playing choices of Bethesda experiences and the constraints that they have because they want to give players everything. He compared it actually to Baldur's Gate 3. He said at Bethesda, the games we were making were so big we had to take the approach of everybody's got to be able to do this at some point. We can't block off content that way. You can see it in our games, we don't. You can get to the heads of all the guilds, you can be friends with all the companions, you can go to all the places, nothing is off limits.
Nothing is off limits is good on one hand, but that does have consequences on the other. Because that just means your choices aren't special. Needing a second playthrough is actually really good for good games. Because you can't do every choice. You can't see every option. And if your game is good, people are going to replay it and see what other options happen. For example, Fallout New Vegas. Now, I have literally never chosen anything but the Yes Man ending. And that's like 5+ playthroughs at this point. But I never regret shit.
But when you play Baldur's Gate 3, you get the impression, rightly so, that this decision I'm about to make will close off parts of the game and open up others, and it's meaningful, that means something. And again, Bethesda, Todd Howard's design philosophy is immense player freedom, and I guess player freedom is just letting players have access to every and anything on one playthrough, which I do think hurts a role-playing experience. But Nesmith, a couple of months ago in an interview with Kiwi Talks, actually had more to say about, again, Todd Howard and his design philosophy and some of the things he does behind the scenes. He specifically
we actually saw this, didn't we?
Said this about Todd.
Yeah, we saw this. Admittedly, this was the most boring guy, and we cut him off halfway through, I think.
His time and resource must be spread so thin.
Dr. Pepper.
It is. The
America.
He wants to be able to have his hands in everything, but that's not humanly possible. So you end up with a situation where some things get very lightly touched, and then the things he cares mostly about, he does a deep dive into.
Yeah, we saw that. Starfield is his baby, and, well, look at the reception that it garnered. But, yeah, he's working on Indiana Jones. He just wrapped that up. He's worked on Starfield, Shattered Space.
Gee, I wonder how a narrative-driven experience that has a unique race that has tattoos on their faces, for no fucking reason, by the way, that doesn't even explain that, is not going to be well-received by players. I mean, you got me dead. I don't know how that's possible.
There's the Elder Scrolls Castles mobile game. There's rumors that an Oblivion remake has been in development, the Fallout TV show, and then there's obviously also Fallout 76, the Elder Scrolls 6, and what other unannounced projects that we don't know of. Todd's been busy and almost seems like it's too much.
When you've got 400 people under your belt, what are you going to do? Spend 3/4 of the day?
Also, by the way, this is how I know that not a single person at Bethesda or any of the adjacent studios has even a single shred of talent. Because any normal people, considering Todd Howard is not there, they would just ignore what he says effectively. This happens in a lot of companies. Your boss comes around, shits on your work, you do exactly the same work, change something, and said, boss, we did it as you like, and then he's like, yeah, good. There you go. No one at Bethesda is doing that. If Todd Howard says something is bad in the remake, it seems like people actually, like, scrap everything and do it. That's just being talentless. Pretty pathetic. In any case, 10 out of 10, that was Legacy Killer HD. 10 out of 10, bye! Todd sucks.